Please, Meghan Markle.
Yeah. Somehow Meghan was invited to Fortune's Most Powerful.
The drama inside Westminster didn't just start, it exploded. Out of nowhere, the calm corridors of Parliament transformed into a full-blown political earthquake. Staffers were literally sprinting like something historic had just detonated. Ministers were being yanked out of lunch meetings, dragged into secretive rooms, and everyone's phone was buzzing nonstop. It was chaos mixed with panic, mixed with that unmistakable, oh no, something big just happened, energy. And trust me, this wasn't some tiny policy update. This was a shockwave that shook the entire building from the inside out, because word was spreading, and fast, that the UK government had done something absolutely unprecedented. Parliament had moved not to question, not to review, not to delay, but to literally block Meghan Markle's brand new business empire. Yes, block it. A full stop, a complete freeze. And for a moment, even the most seasoned political reporters were standing there like, wait, what? This wasn't a minor regulatory hiccup. This was Parliament stepping directly into the path of a global business run by a duchess thousands of miles away. Inside Westminster, a confidential document had started circulating, a briefing that was never, ever supposed to leak. But of course, it did. And once it did, everything went nuclear. The leaked document described Meghan's newly forming empire, beauty, wellness, media, celebrity partnerships, as an enterprise taking advantage of royal associations with inadequate oversight. Cold wording, sharp wording, the kind of language that tells you someone inside Parliament was nervous. Very nervous. Then came the moment that changed the temperature in the whole city.
Her jams and her products via these new Netflix shops that are opening in kind of malls in America. It doesn't sound like it's not.
MPs rushed out a fast-tracked motion, drafted so quickly it practically had smoke on it, called the Royal Titles Commercial Protections Amendment. Basically a law to lock down anything even remotely royal adjacent from being used commercially. And guess whose entire business concept was suddenly caught in the crossfire? Meghan's. Inside the committee room, the tension was so thick you could feel it in the air. One MP snapped that Meghan's global influence had grown far beyond the current frameworks. Another fired back, saying Parliament was panicking and passing legislation they didn't even understand. It was messy, heated, and honestly, embarrassingly dramatic. Because the truth, the real truth, was simple. Meghan's business empire had gotten too big for them to comfortably ignore. We're talking projected billion-dollar valuations, Hollywood collaborations, international product lines, and a launch event practically around the corner. Parliament went into hit the brakes before the train leaves the station mode. Across London, journalists were scrambling so desperately for confirmation that newsrooms looked like disaster zones. Emails, texts, calls, everything was exploding at once. Reporters were trying to wrap their heads around the idea that Parliament was stepping in to interfere with a privately owned American-based company before the public had even seen what it was offering.
And Catherine being very regal, doing the diplomatic thing. Then, overseas we had Meghan on another red carpet.
Meanwhile, things in California were strangely calm until Meghan's phone started lighting up like Christmas. First one ping, then 3, then 10. Then her entire team was suddenly drowning in calls. Attorneys, advisors, executives, journalists, everyone wanted answers, and fast. Nobody on Meghan's side expected this. Not the timing, not the intensity, and definitely not the idea that lawmakers thousands of miles away were drafting legislation that could shut down her empire before it fully launched. Some insiders claim her team immediately went into crisis mode. Others said they weren't shocked at all, that this kind of clash was inevitable the moment she stepped outside the royal bubble. What was undeniable? The situation had transformed from a simple business launch into an international political spectacle within minutes. Parliament wasn't just nitpicking marketing. They were proposing restrictions on the commercial use of royal adjacent identities, foreign businesses connected to UK titles, branding that might even hint at royal symbolism, and the wild part? Meghan wasn't even operating in the UK. London was essentially trying to police Montecito. Political commentators jumped in instantly. Some said Parliament had zero jurisdiction. Others insisted Meghan's influence remained tied to her title no matter where she lived. A few suggested this was pure insecurity. Parliament scrambling to regulate something they couldn't control. And then social media did what social media does. It erupted. Hashtag Parliament vs Meghan, hashtag Sussex Empire, hashtag Let Her Build, hashtag Royal Blockade, hashtag Global Duchess. Within minutes, the online world was on fire. American news outlets blasted it everywhere. European experts weighed in. Australian shows were hosting live panels. And all this was happening before the UK even finished drafting the amendment. Investors were suddenly alert. Hollywood producers started muttering behind closed doors. Brand partners wondered if the controversy would be good for business or catastrophic. And here's the twist. Parliament's attempt to stop Meghan had actually made her brand even more powerful, more visible, and more talked about. A free marketing campaign delivered by the UK government. Absolutely wild. But Meghan wasn't celebrating. Not for a second. She knew better. She knew that even the faintest perception of royal conflict could destabilize everything she had spent months carefully building. Inside Westminster, MPs were scrambling, anticipating legal challenges, diplomatic fallout, public backlash, maybe even irritation from American business partners who were already whispering that Parliament had crossed the line. A senior insider described the situation as trying to cage a wildfire after it's already jumped the valley. And Meghan? She stayed silent. Completely silent. Not a statement, not a hint, not even a cryptic Instagram story. Pure, calculated silence. Because while Parliament thought they were controlling the narrative, Meghan was already preparing her next move. And once she made that move, everything, politics, business, the royal dynamic, would shift again. Meghan's silence didn't just speak, it echoed. While Westminster scrambled to steady itself, another shockwave hit from across the Atlantic. American media absolutely pounced on the story, and the framing was brutal. To them, this wasn't just politics. This was a foreign government trying to interfere with a US-based entrepreneur simply because she happened to be a duchess. Headlines spread like wildfire from New York to Los Angeles, painting Parliament's move as a direct attack. Legal analysts were already on live TV, pointing at maps, questioning jurisdiction, arguing over international commercial law. Business commentators compared the situation to global intellectual property battles, the kind that end up in courts for years. But even with all the noise, Meghan's actual concern was much more serious. Investors had started whispering. Suddenly, a few major partners requested urgent clarity calls, which is corporate language for, "We're nervous, really nervous." Some worried about legal fallout, others feared delays, and a small handful even floated the idea of pausing collaborations until the storm settled. Meghan's office, usually calm and clean and filled with soft West Coast sunlight, turned into a tense war room overnight. Her advisors were drafting statements, then deleting them. Lawyers were dissecting every word of Parliament's proposed amendment, trying to anticipate every possible interpretation. PR strategists were mapping out dozens of scenarios, including the worst one, the palace taking Parliament's side. Because even if nobody wanted to say it out loud, everyone in that room knew the truth. If Buckingham Palace publicly supported Parliament's move, Meghan's empire could take a hit powerful enough to rattle the whole structure. But inside the palace? Oh, it wasn't smooth sailing either. Senior courtiers were caught in their own tug of war. Some feared the monarchy would look vindictive. Blocking a former royal from building a private business would make the crown appear petty. Others were terrified that letting Meghan's empire grow unchecked could blur the lines of royal identity, something the institution protected like a sacred relic. Whoever won that internal battle would determine whether this situation turned into a calm drizzle or a full-blown royal hurricane. Meanwhile, back in the US, Meghan walked into what one insider called the most decisive meeting of her post-royal life. And contrary to what her critics might expect, she didn't storm in angrily. She didn't look shaken, she wasn't rattled. She walked in calm, collected, and frighteningly focused. The kind of focus that makes even experts sit up straighter. She listened to everyone, every lawyer, every strategist, every advisor, and then made a move that caught even her own team off guard. She chose not to fight Parliament directly, no aggressive statements, no legal threats, no reactive messaging. Instead, she would outmaneuver them. Her plan? Bold, elegant, genius, and totally unstoppable. She would expand her empire even faster, into industries, territories, and digital markets that Parliament didn't even have the power to touch. No reliance on the UK, no strategic ties they could twist. Entire sectors completely outside their jurisdiction. This wasn't a retreat, it was a pivot. A swift strategic sidestep that transformed the narrative from Meghan versus the UK into Meghan building a global force Parliament can't even reach. But the world wasn't done reacting. By evening, social media had split into two massive armies. One side roasted Parliament for overreach. The other insisted that protecting royal symbols was necessary. Thousands of creators were posting hour-by-hour analyses. Huge YouTubers, TikTok commentators, and political influencers were dissecting every angle. Even celebrities got involved, liking posts, reposting cryptic comments, subtly picking sides. And then, something absolutely unexpected happened. An anonymous former MP stepped forward, spilling tea that changed everything. According to this insider, the amendment hadn't been a collective decision. It had been pushed through in a rush by a small group of influential members who were extremely passionate about protecting the crown. That revelation hit Westminster like a bomb. Suddenly, reporters were demanding transparency. Opposition parties were questioning the urgency and legitimacy of the move. Political analysts warned that the UK was crossing a dangerous line. risking the appearance of interfering with private enterprise. Debate inside Parliament, already heated, turned volcanic, and Meghan, still silent, perfectly, meticulously silent, until the next morning. Her team dropped a statement so calm, so clean, so absolutely composed that it sent both her supporters and critics spinning. Our focus remains on building a global brand based on integrity, creativity, and community impact. We look forward to continuing our work with partners around the world. That was it. No anger, no defensiveness, no shade. Just 12 deliberate words. And those 12 words hit harder than any press conference could have. Across social media, the reaction was instant. Supporters praised her poise, critics accused her of dodging. Business analysts called the statement a masterclass in redirecting narrative pressure. And quietly, some MPs started getting irritated. They had clearly expected Meghan to explode, panic, or lash out. Instead, she stayed composed, and that made their move look even more reactionary. Then came her counterpunch. While Parliament was still tripping over its own arguments, Meghan's team announced a giant new expansion in South America, a massive new sector of her empire. Fully funded, investor-backed, and completely outside the UK's reach. And Parliament couldn't stop a single inch of it. The timing was surgical, the message unmistakable. Meghan wasn't fighting the UK, she was outgrowing it. Inside Westminster, the mood shifted from bold defiance to an uncomfortable, creeping unease. Some MPs finally realized they had severely underestimated her. Others worried about diplomatic consequences, especially with America watching closely and investors already sending warning signals. This entire saga had escalated past a branding issue. It had become a collision of influence. Global celebrity power versus centuries-old monarchy authority, and the world was watching every second. But the final twist came only hours later. A senior parliamentary advisor leaked a memo, a quiet, subtle admission that the legislation would likely need to be revised. In other words, Parliament had moved too fast, too aggressively, and possibly without enforceable grounds. For Meghan, this was a silent victory. Her empire stood untouched. Her influence had actually grown, and the UK's attempt to contain her had turned into the very thing that amplified her brand worldwide. The debate wasn't over. Parliament would continue arguing for weeks, but the balance of power had already shifted. Meghan now stood not as a duchess seeking institutional approval, but as a global business force Parliament could no longer ignore.